Good morning. Today I will be presenting a look at traditional education versus learning centers. First, let's define our terms. Traditional education is a teacher-centered delivery of instruction to classes of students who are active receivers of information. That would be just like this class right now. You have a teacher up front who is teaching the students who are sitting in the desk, who are actively listening and receiving the information that the teacher is telling to the students, versus a learning center, which is a self-contained area of the classroom in which students engage in independent and self-directed learning activities. These learning centers are typically used in elementary and middle school settings, but not as much in high school settings. And what they are is you'd set up different activities throughout the room, usually on the sides or back of the classroom, wherever you have space. And there are individual activities that the students can go to, and they can just work on those activities by themselves in that learning center. The differences between traditional education and learning centers are traditional education, the focus is on the teacher. The teacher's up front, the students are paying attention to what the teacher has to say. The students are not focusing on anything else around the classroom, they're just focusing on the teacher. It's teacher directed. The teacher is telling the students what to do. They're telling them what problems to work on. They're telling them what to read from their book. The teacher is the one running the show. And the instructor is talking, the students are listening. The students should not be talking in a traditional classroom. They should be listening to the teacher, as the teacher is the one giving them all of the information they need to know. Whereas in a learning center, the focus is on the student. The teacher is not in front of the room talking in a learning center. The teacher is not really part of the learning centers at all. The students are the ones who are doing the problems on the side in their learning centers. Say they did math that day and the learning centers are all about addition. They'd be on the sides of the room, they'd be doing something such as adding different colored blocks together, playing a math game, something like maybe Connect 4, or doing a multiplication thing, or they'd be doing maybe a coloring sheet that has the division and addition and multiplication symbols on it. It would be stuff like that. And it would all be the student doing it. The instructor really has no part. It's all student directed, kind of like I said. The students are doing all of it. The teacher really does not play a role in the learning center other than setting them up. And the instructor monitors. This is the main extent of the instructor's role. They're just making sure that the centers are going well, no one's fooling around, they're understanding what they should be doing, and trying to get the students all to interact with the centers and with each other. In a traditional setting, the instructor chooses what they're going to do. The instructor decides, we are going to do math, we are going to do English, we're going to do science, we're going to do history. The student has no say over what they're going to do. And the instructor evaluates. The instructor is able to determine whether or not the students are learning. They can walk up and down the aisles and check their sheets they're working on to make sure that they're understanding the problems or the activity that they're working on. The teacher can ask questions, they can give quizzes, they can give tests. There's many ways for a teacher to evaluate the student's learning in a traditional setting. Whereas in a learning center, the student can choose what activities they want to do. The activities, the learning centers, are set up all around the room, and the student can go to whichever one they so please. And evaluation is very limited. There's no test, quizzes, questions that occur during these learning centers. The extent of evaluation a teacher can really do is they watch and see what the students are doing and can notice things such as, okay, Johnny is counting really well in that game, but Sam, he's a little bit slower, he's not as fast, so maybe I should work with him a little bit more later, individually one-on-one. That's about the extent of evaluation that occurs in a learning center. Some of the supposed strengths of learning centers are that students have responsibility for their own learning. This is all based on the idea that students are intrinsically motivated to learn. If you release them into a situation where they have the responsibility to learn, they're going to take hold of that, they're going to take responsibility, and they're going to want to learn. They're going to want to do all these learning centers that you've set up for them. So that is considered a positive to these learning centers, is that it gives the students the chance to take that responsibility, as well as it's a chance to review. Instead of doing something such as a remedial paper, students can go and review in these learning center styles. Like we use the addition example before, if you taught addition in your classroom that day, and then you had learning centers that all center around addition type activities, that's another way for the students to review over addition versus just doing a sheet or asking questions or playing a game with your class. The students control the pace. This is positive because you know that you have different levels of learners in your classroom. You have the slow learners, average, you have the advanced learners. The advanced learners are not held behind by the slow learners, and the slow learners, they don't have to feel rushed and can take the time they need to learn and go over the activities in these learning centers. As well as students can work together. They're encouraged to work together to figure out the problems to review in these learning centers. It helps them learn how to work with each other, and it also develops interpersonal skills. They're allowed to talk throughout these learning centers. They're allowed to socialize, so they get to become more skilled interpersonally. And then the change of pace helps learning to be fun. You are getting out of your seat, you're getting to do something different, and it can be really fun for the students, and the change of pace helps lighten the mood. It helps relieve maybe some of the boredom that could be happening in your class. There's a lot of weaknesses that are associated with learning centers, with the first being directly against the first positive that I put up there, which is that students are not intrinsically motivated to learn. Anyone who has taught a class knows this, that they have students that do not want to learn, and you have to push them to learn at every moment. If you give students all the responsibility for their learning, some will take it, but that is the exception, not the rule. Most students are not going to do much in these learning centers. They may find it interesting for a minute, but they're not going to push themselves to learn without someone right there helping them and making them do it. They can be costly. Teachers are expected to set up multiple learning centers throughout the week. So they're doing a different learning center maybe once or twice a week, but with how many weeks there are at school, that is a lot of learning centers. And usually schools don't have a budget set for teachers to set up their learning centers, especially in smaller schools. So that cost is set upon the teacher, which then reduces the quality, because if the teacher doesn't have the money to spend on coming up with these really engaging learning centers, they're just going to print out activity papers or something like that. They can take up a lot of space. In this classroom right here, we don't have a lot of space on the back wall or the sides. For us to set up learning centers, we'd have to rearrange this entire classroom. And space is a high commodity, especially in a small school. Learning centers tend to be noisy because the students can work together and they're encouraged to talk to one another. It can get out of hand quite quickly, and they can be very loud, which can be disturbing to the rest of the school. And it's hard to determine if students are learning. Because the evaluation is very limited, deciding whether or not the students are learning can be quite difficult. And it can turn into a playtime instead of learning time, especially since teachers do not really have the time to set up different learning centers every single week with all the other things they need to get ready. It tends to turn into a playtime with teachers just setting up blocks, setting up activity papers, things like that. Let's go ahead and look at traditional education strengths, with the first one being that there's a lot of student-teacher interaction. If a student has a question, they can ask their teacher. If the teacher sees that the student is struggling, the teacher can help. There's a lot of interaction with the student and the teacher, which means that a student that's slow, that should not be missed by the teacher because they should be interacting with that student. The students are able to get the help they need in a traditional classroom. Traditional structure is familiar to students. Most students have grown up in a traditional classroom, so switching up to learning centers can be confusing for them, and it can be hard for the teacher to try to explain what they're supposed to be doing. So they can lose a lot of time, and if you just use a traditional structure, which is familiar to students, it can help you out. In a traditional classroom, the learning is all teacher-directed. This is a positive because the students don't know where they're going. They don't know how one thing might build upon another. The teacher is able to direct them, to show them what they should be learning, to really engage them and help them learn. In a traditional classroom, you can teach to a large group. I can teach to 30 people comfortably, whereas in learning centers, it's very hard because they require so much space to accommodate 30 kids. That'd be very difficult. Whereas right now, I can teach the 30 students very easily. I can easily evaluate student learning in a traditional classroom. I can ask questions, I can give quizzes, I can give tests. It's very easy for me to determine whether or not a student is learning. Whereas in a learning center, it's quite hard. And it's cost and space effective. As I said before, I can teach 30 students. If the curriculum is once the curriculum is bought by the school, you don't have to buy it again. You're not continually having to set up your classroom, whereas in the learning centers, you're continually having to set these things up, which can be quite costly versus traditional education. Some of the weaknesses of traditional education is there's little room for flexibility. This really is up to the teacher. There can be lots of room for flexibility in how they present a subject, but what they're presenting, they usually have very little room in that regard. They don't have a choice on what they want to present for math or what they want to present for English, but they do have a choice on how they present it, and that's where their flexibility can come in. It can promote memorization over critical thinking. This is not such a big deal in the lower grades, but in the upper grades, this can be a problem if students have only learned how to memorize things and they don't develop those critical thinking skills. They can struggle in higher grades. So trying to integrate critical thinking questions, critical thinking activities into your classroom is important. It does favor one learning style. It mainly favors auditory learning, and only about 40% of students are 100% auditory learners. Most students need something else. So bringing in demonstrations, something the students can feel, see, touch, or just any other things like that can really overcome this weakness. Slower students can be left behind. Again, this would be the fault of the teacher. The teacher needs to evaluate which students are slower and help them, but this can happen in a traditional classroom. They can be boring. Again, teacher's fault if it's boring. And there's little to no individuality. The students are all required to do the same thing, they're required to learn the same thing, and there's very little individuality in the classrooms. Impact on present education. Currently, learning centers are used a lot throughout American public schools, and they really further the progressive movement. The progressive movement is really pounding individuality, critical thinking skills, and being able to work on your own independently to figure things out. And learning centers fit the bill for all of these things. Currently, studies show that most learning centers turn into unproductive playtime. This is because that learning centers are not integrated into the curriculum. Their teachers are more just told to implement it into their classroom. And while they're doing that, they're not doing it very effectively. They're generally just setting out papers or fun activities, not necessarily learning activities. So it just turns into playtime. If it was better used, centers could have a positive impact, but because they're not being used properly, they've been turning into just playtime, which has had a negative effect on education as a whole. As far as the future influence on education, learning centers are not going away. They're going to continue. And it's thought that they're going to become more technologically advanced. What the Learning Center movement wants to do right now is they want to develop programs for computers that they can put into the classrooms. So when the teachers send the students to their centers, they're just going to a computer and they can work on a learning center that's already set up for them in the computer. So the teacher does not have to think of all these activities for the students to do. But a problem with this is that it would be extremely costly for the school to buy computers for every single student. And when implemented correctly, they can have a positive impact on education. I believe that centers have generally been used wrong, and that if you use them correctly, sparingly, I think that they can have a positive impact on education. So in conclusion, sparing use, I think they can be sparingly used in place of remedial activity papers. Say that if every month or every 2 weeks, instead of doing your multiplication math papers, you had math games or activities set up for the students to go do. It would require a lot of control from the teacher, making sure that it's going to get out of hand and knowing what your students can handle. But as long as you know that they are learning and practicing what you want them to be learning and practicing in those activities, they can be used and implemented well. But learning centers will never replace the teacher. The teacher is the one that spurs learning, not the learning centers. Students will not take responsibility for their own learning 100%. They need the teachers to help them learn. If you're interested in any of my research, here is all the bibliography and information, and it is also on the handout that I gave you. Thank you very much.